Welcome to another episode of Witty CFB. Your host, Rob Sheply here. And on today's episode, we're going to be breaking down the Florida State Seminoles, in particular, the glaring weaknesses that they've had throughout the season, and also how can they turn this around, both in the short term and the long term, and also are there any comparable situations that we've seen this sort of situation before. Now, I think needless to say, you've heard other analysts talk about this, particularly Greg McElroy or Joel Klatt, and all those guys are all great analysts, by the way. But going into this season, they were ranked 10th in the country in the AP preseason poll. They were ranked 29th in the recruiting class as of 2025, and also they got snubbed out of the college football playoff last year too. So when you kind of combine all those things together, it definitely is one of those things where they've gotten the short end of the stick in a multitude of different ways too. And it was really a tough to watch, particularly week. You remember week 1 versus Georgia Tech. Then you have another stunning loss against Boston College. Then Memphis, and then obviously this past week gets at SMU. There are a number of different things that are not going in their way too. Even if you want to go back all the way to last year too, where they got blown out in the Orange Bowl too, primarily because once when the team found out they didn't make the playoff, half the team sat out, half the team transferred, and then there are a bunch of guys going to the NFL too. So when you combine all of that together, it was just kind of sad to watch too, because as somebody who does respect and appreciate a team that does go undefeated, it was definitely still a big controversy, and still one that I quite frankly don't agree with. But in any event, we've we've seen a couple of different things from Florida State that definitely is really troubling in general. This past Tuesday, another 4-star recruit decided to decommit from Florida State. That's the third 4-star since the beginning of the season. So between between that, and also I want to add to the Florida State, I think in general has had some pretty lackluster recruiting classes pretty consistently for the past couple seasons. Even in general too, when you kind of think about, I don't recall really any particular time where Florida State had a top 10 or a top 15 recruiting class. They're always somewhere between that 17 to 30 range, which if you are going to legitimately contend for a national championship, that's just not it's just not good enough to be doing that too. Because I do think Mike Norvell deserves some credit for what he's done. I think he had a hell of a season last year. I do think he knows how to. I think he's a brilliant motivator. I think he knows his X's and O's. I think he carries the team with a level of prestige and credibility and all those things too. But one has to wonder where, is the message growing stale? Is it just that the talent's not there? Is it, what there seems like there's a multitude of things going on. And, when I put this all together, there's a couple things that kind of come to mind as well. Right now, I think one of the things that we have to think about when we're looking at Florida State kind of in a full circle lens is, you know, Florida State has one of the most experienced offensive lines in the entire country, and they have a lot of different playmakers too. I first guy that comes to mind is Keon Coleman, who last season was one of the most electrifying, exciting receivers in all of college football last year, and we really haven't seen much of him this season compared to you think I think of him, and I also think of Johnny Walker as well, who's also another really talented receiver who wasn't anticipated to be making a bunch of plays this year, and we haven't. It's just been kind of lackluster in terms of the productivity of Florida State's offense as well. And even in general, they've kind of built this roster around having playmakers, having guys who can get big explosive plays, having guys who can get yards after catch, and being able to put DJ in situations where he doesn't necessarily have to take a game over, but as long as he's making the correct reads, he's finding the open receivers, and Florida State's controlling the tempo of the game. That was kind of their bread and butter last year. Be able to have those explosive plays and be able to control the tempo of the game as much as they can. And going into this season, they're ranked 82nd in the country right now in explosive plays, or in particular plays of 20 yards or more, which is a stark contrast to the Florida State football that we're watching last year. And when I think about this team full circle, I think it's one of the things that you're really sort of missing from this team in general. And then the other thing you have to kind of that's combating with this as well is you, on top of the teams that they've already lost to, which I just briefly alluded to, you also have Duke, Miami, and Notre Dame all still on the horizon coming up too. So when you combine all of those things, we can be sitting here talking about 3 weeks from now Florida State being 1-7. So going from a preseason AP poll top 10 to all of a sudden going 1-7 is certainly realistic with the way that the trajectory is going of this program. Now, I was sitting here kind of thinking to myself, are there any sort of comparable instances where, where a program has kind of, had this sudden falling from grace and then had this immaculate comeback? And, I don't necessarily want to sit there and talk about first year turnarounds because, you can talk about June Jones at Hawaii. You can talk about Jim Moore at UConn. You can even talk about Sam Golish at South Florida, who went from 1-11 to 5-6. But if in terms of head coaches who have already been at a program for a while and kind of had a super down year and then turned around the next year and really had a legitimate sort of comeback season, somebody on Reddit said this too, and I don't know their name, but I'll give them a shout out too when somebody first mentioned this. But Brian 2016 Brian Kelly, when they went 4-8 and they turned around in 2017 and had I believe a 10+ season. That's really the only comparable sort of equivalent that kind of comes to mind when you think about it too. I mean, granted, I think that 2016 season they had a lot of injuries there. They didn't have as many playmakers as I think this Florida State team does. So there is some similarities in the sense of, Brian Kelly that season pretty much was pressured by the Notre Dame administration to had to completely overhaul his staff, had to get rid of the people that weren't pulling their weight, and ultimately was able to turn it around. And a couple seasons later, he was ended up going to LSU. So it definitely is possible to be able to have this sort of turnaround. I think what you have to kind of ask yourself now is how much pressure is Florida State's administration, presidents, chancellors, all of that good stuff are going to put on Mike Norvell to drastically change the coaching staff, because I think to some extent you're gonna have to at least force him to do something, because if you give Mike Norvell another season, which I would anticipate they're probably gonna have to, you know, to what extent, like to what kind of moves do you think we're gonna see? And I think first and foremost too, I mean, obviously you're not gonna have DJ there. I mean, Brock Glenn, I mean, a he's kind of struggled, all things considered, when you think about his um, starting capabilities. I mean, he doesn't have the strongest arm. He's doesn't have a lot of mobility. 19 for 55 when he's played in the ACC championship on the Orange Bowl. Hasn't had a single touchdown yet. So I mean, he's had some big game experience, but when you're really thinking about it, it's there's not much there to suggest that Florida State's going to turn it around. So at this point, you're more kind of thinking about not necessarily next season, but what, as a if you were a Florida State fan, what kind of changes should you be anticipating going into next year? And then in the short term, what kind of changes or what do you need to see to really be able to get enough momentum to the point where you don't feel like that you have to completely clean house and not only fire a lot of Norvell staff, but also Norvell himself. And I talked about the recruiting issues and the Florida State administration, but I guess another thing that came to mind thinking about this whole situation too, because again, there hasn't really been that sort of equivalent where somebody's gone from the top 10 to where they are now. But I think one has to wonder too. I don't want to stir the pot too much, but would there be a world where Florida State would be interested in bringing back Jimbo Fisher? I know that's stirring the pot a little bit, considering Jimbo's very um, tumultuous exit at Texas A&M, where he got a $70 million plus buyout. I mean, you would have to imagine that Jimbo would be willing to take a significant um, hometown discount in order to come back and be able to, go back to where he had the most success of his career, and he won a national championship with Jameis Winston as his quarterback. You have to imagine that you're instantly a little bit intrigued by that. I mean, I I think at the moment it sounds more of like a fantasy than it does something that can come to fruition. But I think if you're Florida State administration, I think you have to at least possibly consider that, because if you're going to fire someone who's had the caliber of Mike Norvell and who went undefeated last year and for the most part has been a pretty consistent coach, if you're firing Norvell, you got to have a home run guy where you're sitting there saying, okay, I think this guy is going to turn it around quick and once again bring bring the same sort of credibility and prestige that, you know, guys like Jimbo Fisher did and Bobby Bowden did, and, all those years and years of history too. And, when it comes down to it, I mean, yes, there's not a lot of things that are going great. I mean, DJ broke his finger, and he's struggling even making the most basic throws in the field. I mean, even when I was watching the Boston College game and the SMU game, I mean, he was missing, 5 yard screen routes and basic curls and mesh routes where it's just quite frankly unacceptable. And then when you're Norvell and you see him throw that final pick six before he got benched, I mean, you got to a point where you just had to you just had to make a move. And when you're, thinking about that full circle, it definitely goes to show that there's going to be a lot of different changes that are going to happen. I would anticipate a significant shakeup with their coaching staff. You're going to lose a lot of the experience that you have particularly in the offensive side of the ball. Because I mean, I mentioned it earlier. One of the most experienced offensive lines in the entire country. You have a lot of different playmakers, and you also have a pretty top-heavy sort of program where I would not be surprised going into next year that they're really going to try to fill in some gaps using the transfer portal. And I think you're also going to see them really try to amp up those recruiting efforts, particularly bringing in some assistants who have that sort of background of being able to recruit at a high level in Florida, but also being able to really take advantage of some pipeline states such as your Georgias, your Alabamas, or your Louisiana too. So going into it, it's going to be difficult to see, you know, the light at the end of the tunnel given the schedule that you have coming up. You don't have much of a track record in terms of Brock Kelly having much success. You have a Clemson team that has significantly improved since the ass whooping that they had week one against Georgia. And also, you're going to have the rumblings of, is Mike Norvell the guy that can, lead them to another run like they did last season, or was that the pinnacle of what he can bring to this program? And then, if you do decide that Mike Norvell isn't that guy, I mean, would you consider another run with Jimbo Fisher? So, with all that being said, I think there's a lot of different elements that's going on with Florida State, and I'd love to hear your comments as well, particularly for fans who cover Florida State and watch the games a lot more extensively than I do.